My name is Joaquin Esperanza, and I'm a gardener who survived the first 30 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted and blocked out the sun, I had to lead my East LA community through freezing temperatures, food shortages, and violent gangs while keeping my family alive. I thought growing food made me prepared for anything, but nothing could have prepared me for this. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Esperanza, and before October 10th, 2025, I thought I understood what it meant to prepare people for hard times. I ran the Tierra Verde community gardens across East Los Angeles, transforming abandoned lots into thriving food sources that fed over 200 families. I specialized in drought-resistant crops, taught sustainable farming techniques, and had spent years developing seed varieties that could survive increasingly harsh California climates. People called me the neighborhood's lifeline, the guy who could make anything grow anywhere. But when the Yellowstone supervolcano erupted and triggered an ice age, I learned that all my expertise meant nothing if the sun itself stopped shining. That morning started like any other October day in Los Angeles. I was kneeling in the tomato beds at our largest community garden site in Boyle Heights, checking the late-season harvest that would help families stretch their food budgets through the winter months. The sun felt warm on my back as I worked, and the soil beneath my hands was rich and dark from years of careful composting. These weren't just plants to me. Every tomato vine, every pepper plant, every row of leafy greens represented someone's dinner, someone's nutrition, someone's hope that they could feed their family without depending entirely on an expensive grocery store. My grandmother always said I had my grandfather's hands for growing things. She would sit on her porch every morning, watching me tend the plants, and tell stories about how my grandfather had fed their whole neighborhood during the Depression using nothing but determination and seeds he saved from year to year. I kept those stories close to my heart, especially the ones about his old root cellar where he stored vegetables through the winter and sprouted seeds when fresh food was impossible to find. Back then, I thought those stories were just family history. I had no idea they would soon become my survival manual. The earthquake hit at exactly 10:37 in the morning. I remember the time because I had just checked my phone to see if my sister Rosa had texted me back about bringing lunch to the garden. But this wasn't like the California earthquakes we all knew by heart. This tremor felt different, deeper, like the earth itself was groaning in pain. The soil beneath my hands vibrated with a frequency that made my teeth ache. Plants that had been perfectly still in the calm morning air began swaying without any wind. The irrigation lines I had installed throughout the garden started rattling against their support posts. I stood up and looked around at the other volunteers working in different sections of the garden. Maria, who had been weeding the pepper rows, was gripping her trowel with white knuckles. Carlos, who came every Tuesday to help with the composting, had stopped mid-shovel and was staring at the ground like he was waiting for it to open up beneath him. We all felt it. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something that would pass in 30 seconds and leave us laughing nervously about. California's latest reminder that we lived on unstable ground. The shaking lasted almost 2 full minutes. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed felt heavier than the tremor itself. Birds that had been chirping in the fruit trees went quiet. Even the traffic noise from the nearby freeway seemed muted. I found myself checking each plant instinctively, looking for damage, making sure the irrigation system was still intact. That was my first priority always. Protect the plants. Protect the food. Protect what feeds the community. My phone started buzzing with text messages and calls, but the cell towers were overwhelmed. I could barely get through to anyone. The few messages that did come through were from neighbors asking if I was okay, if the garden was damaged, if they should be worried. I spent the rest of the morning reassuring people, checking on the other garden sites throughout the neighborhood. and trying to piece together what had happened from the scattered radio reports that were starting to come in. The early news reports were vague and confusing. Something about significant geological activity in Wyoming. Seismic events near Yellowstone National Park. Scientists were being cautious with their language, using terms like unusual volcanic activity and monitoring the situation closely. None of it sounded particularly alarming to someone living in Los Angeles. Wyoming felt like it might as well be on another planet. We had our own earthquakes to worry about. But as the day wore on, the reports became more specific and more frightening. By afternoon, the news stations were showing footage of a massive eruption, a column of ash and smoke rising higher than commercial airliners could fly. The images looked like something from a disaster movie, too dramatic and enormous to feel real. Scientists were starting to use words like supervolcano and unprecedented scale. They were talking about ash clouds and climate impacts and the need to monitor air quality across the western United States. I remember standing in the garden that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, and thinking how beautiful it looked. I didn't know then that those colors were the first sign of ash particles in the upper atmosphere, scattering light in ways that created spectacular sunsets and deadly consequences. I didn't know that I was looking at the last normal sunset I would see for months, maybe years. My grandmother was sitting on her porch when I stopped by her house that night, wrapped in the wool blanket she had been using every evening since the weather started getting cooler. She had been born in 1943, lived through more changes and challenges than most people could imagine, and she had a way of sensing when something was truly wrong before anyone else caught on. When I told her about the earthquake and the news reports from Wyoming, she just nodded slowly and said in Spanish that the earth was angry about something. She told me that her own grandmother had lived through the year without a summer back in 1816, when a volcanic eruption in Indonesia had caused global climate changes that led to crop failures and famine across the world. She said that her great-grandmother had always warned that the earth would eventually remind humanity that we were not in control of everything, that nature could change the rules whenever it wanted. At the time, I thought she was just sharing old family stories. I didn't understand that she was trying to prepare me for what was coming. Rosa came by the garden the next morning, bringing coffee and the worried expression she always wore when she thought I was taking on too much responsibility. She had been helping me run the community gardens for 3 years, handling the administrative side while I focused on the growing and teaching. She was better with people than I was better at organizing community meetings and resolving conflicts between families who wanted access to the same garden plots. She was also the one who kept track of our emergency supplies, our seed inventory, and our contingency plans for things like drought or pest infestations. She had been watching the news coverage all night, and she was scared in a way that I had never seen before. She showed me footage of the ash clouds spreading across multiple states, satellite images that made it look like a gray blanket was being pulled across the entire western half of the country. She had been reading scientific articles about volcanic winters and global cooling events, trying to understand what this might mean for our region, for our gardens, for the families who depended on us for fresh food. I tried to reassure her that we were prepared for emergencies. We had emergency seed stores, backup irrigation systems, and relationships with suppliers who could help us get resources if our local systems were disrupted. We had weathered droughts, pest infestations, and economic downturns that had made it harder for families to afford food. We had contingency plans and community support networks and years of experience adapting to changing conditions. But Rosa had always been the one who thought further ahead than I did, who worried about scenarios that seemed unlikely but catastrophic. She was the one who had insisted we create multiple backup seed storage locations, who had pushed me to learn traditional preservation techniques that didn't require modern equipment, who had built relationships with rural farmers who could potentially supply us if urban food systems failed. She was looking at the news coverage and seeing possibilities that I wasn't ready to consider. The second day after the eruption, I noticed that the sunlight felt different. It was subtle at first, like the difference between a sunny day and a day with high, thin clouds that you can barely see. But as someone who spent most of my time outdoors, working with plants that depended on precise amounts of sunlight for photosynthesis, I could feel the change. The light was flatter, less intense, filtered through something that wasn't quite visible, but was definitely there. The plants felt it too. The tomatoes that had been ripening beautifully just 2 days earlier seemed to slow their progress. The leafy greens that thrived in the fall weather were looking less vibrant, less energetic. Even the hardy succulents that could survive almost anything California threw at them seemed to be conserving their energy, pulling inward in ways that suggested they were preparing for something difficult. I spent that day checking on all our garden sites, talking to the regular volunteers and community members who came by to help with maintenance or to harvest vegetables for their families. Everyone was asking the same questions. Was this going to affect our local weather? Should they be worried about their home gardens? Were we going to have problems with the winter growing season that we had been planning for months? I didn't have good answers for any of them. Everything I knew about growing food was based on predictable seasonal patterns, stable climate conditions, and reliable access to water and sunlight. I had learned to adapt to drought, to work with poor soil, to maximize production in small spaces. But I had never had to figure out how to grow food when the sun itself was being blocked by volcanic ash. That evening, I went to check on our main seed storage facility, a climate-controlled room that we had set up in the basement of the community center. We had spent years collecting and preserving seeds from the best-performing plants in our gardens, creating a genetic library that could help us adapt to changing conditions and provide food security for our community. We had varieties that were drought-resistant, pest-resistant, and adapted to the specific soil and climate conditions of Los Angeles. Looking at those carefully labeled containers of seeds, I felt a mix of pride and anxiety that I couldn't quite explain. These seeds represented years of work, generations of plant breeding, and the potential to feed hundreds of families. But they also represented something more fragile than I had ever acknowledged. They were adapted to the world as it had been, not necessarily to the world as it might become. I found myself thinking about my grandfather's stories, about the Depression era, techniques that had kept his family fed when normal food systems failed. My grandmother had tried to teach me some of those techniques over the years, but I had always been more interested in modern sustainable agriculture, in efficient irrigation systems, and scientific soil management. I had respected the old ways, but hadn't seen them as relevant to my work. That night, I called my grandmother and asked her to tell me everything she remembered about her father's root cellar, about the food preservation methods he had used, about the varieties of plants he had grown that could survive in difficult conditions. She seemed pleased that I was finally asking about these things, but I could hear worry in her voice too. She asked me if I thought we were going to need those old techniques. I told her I didn't know, but I wanted to be prepared for anything. The third day after the eruption was when everything changed. I woke up to a phone call from Carlos, who lived a few blocks from the main garden and usually arrived before me every morning to check on things. His voice was shaking when he told me I needed to come see what had happened overnight. He wouldn't describe it over the phone, just kept saying that something was very wrong and that I needed to get there immediately. When I arrived at the garden, I understood why he couldn't find words for what he was seeing. The plants looked like they had aged months in a single night. The tomato vines that had been green and healthy yesterday were now wilted and brown at the edges. The pepper plants were drooping like they were severely dehydrated, even though the irrigation system had been running perfectly and the soil was still moist. The leafy greens that had been thriving in the fall weather were now curled and discolored. pulling their leaves inward like they were trying to protect themselves from something in the air. But it wasn't just the plants that looked wrong. The light itself felt different, dimmer and flatter than it should have been at 8 o'clock in the morning. The sky was still blue, but it was a washed-out blue, like someone had turned down the contrast on the entire world. And there was something in the air, a fine grit that you could taste when you breathed deeply, that made your eyes water slightly if you weren't careful. I spent the morning examining every plant, checking soil moisture levels, testing the irrigation system, trying to find a technical explanation for what was happening. But deep down, I already knew what was causing it. The ash cloud from Yellowstone was starting to affect our local weather patterns, filtering the sunlight that our plants needed for photosynthesis, changing the chemical composition of the air they were breathing. Other community members started arriving throughout the morning, and I could see the fear in their faces as they looked at plants that had been healthy and productive just days earlier. These were people who depended on our gardens for a significant portion of their fresh food. Families who had been planning their meals around the vegetables they expected to harvest over the next few weeks. They were looking at me for reassurance, for solutions, for some kind of plan that would make everything okay again. I found myself making promises that I wasn't sure I could keep. I told them that we would figure out how to protect the plants, that we would find ways to adapt our growing techniques, that we would make sure everyone continued to have access to fresh food. But even as I said these things, I was calculating how long our current harvest could last, how much food we had in storage, how quickly we could implement emergency growing techniques that I had never actually tried before. That afternoon, the temperature dropped 15 degrees in the span of 4 hours. It wasn't a gradual cooling like you might expect with changing weather patterns. It was a sudden dramatic shift that felt like someone had opened a giant refrigerator door over the entire city. I watched the thermometer in the garden go from 78 degrees to 63 degrees while I was checking on the irrigation system, and I knew that this wasn't a normal weather event. My grandmother was sitting on her porch when I stopped by that evening, wrapped in 2 blankets instead of her usual one. She looked up at the sky, which was now a strange grayish color that didn't match any weather pattern I had ever seen in Los Angeles, and said quietly that winter was coming early this year. She said it in Spanish, using the same tone she used when she was sharing important family history, like she was passing down information that I would need to remember. I asked her what she meant, and she told me that her great-grandmother had described skies that looked like this before the year without a summer. She said that when volcanoes erupted with enough force to change the color of the sky, it meant that the seasons were going to be different, that the usual patterns of weather and growing couldn't be trusted anymore. She said that her great-grandmother had always kept extra seeds and preserved food, not just for regular emergencies, but for the kind of emergencies that could last for years. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the plants in the garden, about the families who were counting on me to keep the food supply stable, about the seed storage facility that suddenly felt like the most important thing I had ever been responsible for. I found myself making mental lists of everything I knew about cold weather growing, about extending growing seasons, about emergency food production techniques. I thought about the root cellar that my grandfather had built behind my grandmother's house, which had been sealed up for decades, but might still be structurally sound. I thought about the traditional preservation methods that I had learned, but never practiced, the sprouting techniques that could turn stored seeds into fresh nutrition, even in impossible conditions. I thought about the community networks that we had built over years of working together, and wondered if they would be strong enough to survive what was coming. But mostly, I thought about the look in my grandmother's eyes when she had talked about winter coming early. She had lived through more changes and challenges than most people could imagine, and she had a way of understanding when something was truly different, truly dangerous. She wasn't just talking about a difficult growing season or a harsh winter. She was talking about the kind of change that would require us to remember skills that most people had forgotten, to rely on resources that most people didn't even know existed. The fourth day after the eruption, I woke up to find a thin layer of ash covering everything in the garden. It looked like gray snow, but it was gritty and sharp when you touched it, and it left a metallic taste in your mouth if you accidentally breathed it in. The ash was covering the leaves of every plant, blocking the sunlight that was already being filtered by the high-altitude cloud. I spent the morning trying to wash it off with the irrigation system, but more kept falling throughout the day. Rosa arrived at the garden carrying a respirator mask and a stack of scientific articles she had printed out overnight. She had been researching volcanic winters and climate change events, trying to understand what we might be facing and how long it might last. The articles were full of technical terms and historical examples, but the basic message was clear. When supervolcanoes erupted with this kind of intensity, they could change global weather patterns for years, causing crop failures and food shortages on a scale that modern agricultural systems weren't designed to handle. She showed me satellite images of the ash cloud, which was now covering most of the western United States and continuing to spread eastward. She showed me historical data about the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, which had caused global cooling and agricultural failures that led to famine in multiple countries. She showed me climate models that suggested the ash cloud from Yellowstone could persist for months or even years, depending on how much material continued to be ejected into the atmosphere. I listened to everything she was telling me, but part of my mind was already moving past the scientific explanations to the practical implications. If the ash cloud was going to persist for months, we needed to figure out how to grow food with limited sunlight. If the temperature was going to continue dropping, we needed to develop cold weather growing techniques. If the normal food distribution systems were going to be disrupted, we needed to increase our production capacity and our food storage capabilities. That afternoon, I made the decision to open our emergency seed storage and begin implementing every cold weather and low-light growing technique that I had ever learned or heard about. I called a community meeting for that evening and asked everyone to bring any emergency food supplies they had at home, any equipment that might be useful for protecting plants from cold or ash, and any knowledge they had about traditional growing or preservation techniques. The meeting was held in the community center, and more people showed up than I had ever seen at one of our regular gatherings. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood that something serious was happening, that the community gardens that everyone depended on were facing problems that none of us had ever dealt with before. People were scared, but they were also ready to work together to find solutions. I stood up in front of the group and told them everything I knew about what was happening. I explained that the volcanic eruption in Wyoming was affecting our local climate in ways that were going to make normal gardening impossible. I told them that we were going to need to implement emergency growing techniques, increase our food storage and preservation capabilities, and work together as a community to make sure everyone continued to have access to nutrition. But even as I was explaining the technical challenges we were facing, I could see that people were starting to understand the deeper implications of what was happening. This wasn't just a gardening problem or a weather problem. This was the kind of event that could change everything about how we lived, how we fed ourselves, how we organized our community. The skills and knowledge that we had developed over years of sustainable agriculture were about to be tested in ways that none of us had ever imagined. The meeting ended with everyone volunteering to help with different aspects of our emergency response. Some people offered to help with constructing protective structures for the plants. Others offered to share preserved food from their home storage. Some of the older community members offered to teach traditional techniques that they remembered from their own families. Everyone understood that we were facing something unprecedented, and that our survival would depend on how well we could adapt and work together. As people were leaving the meeting, my grandmother approached me and said that she thought it was time to open up the old root cellar. She said that her father had designed it to stay warm even in the coldest weather. and that it might be the only place where we could keep plants growing if the temperature continued to drop. She also said that she had been saving seeds from her own garden for decades, varieties that her family had brought from Mexico, and that might be more adapted to difficult growing conditions than the modern varieties we had been using. That night, I went home and made a list of everything we would need to implement our emergency plan: protective materials for the plants, additional storage containers for seeds and preserved food, equipment for creating artificial growing environments, traditional tools for food preservation. But at the top of the list, I wrote down the most important thing we would need, which was the knowledge and skills to adapt to conditions that none of us had ever experienced before. I realized that everything I thought I knew about growing food was about to be challenged. The expertise that had made me a trusted leader in the community was based on predictable seasonal patterns, stable climate conditions, and reliable access to resources. I was about to learn whether the fundamental principles of sustainable agriculture could be adapted to survive in a world where the sun itself was no longer reliable. The 5th day after the eruption, I woke up to find ice crystals forming on the windows of my house in October in Los Angeles. I had lived in Southern California my entire life, and I had never seen ice form naturally on anything except maybe the tops of mountains during the coldest winter nights. But here it was, covering my windows like delicate lace, a beautiful and terrifying sign that the world was changing faster than any of us had anticipated. When I arrived at the garden that morning, I found that the ashfall had increased overnight, and many of the plants were now completely covered with a gray coating that made them look like sculptures in a post-apocalyptic art exhibit. The few plants that were still partially visible were showing signs of severe stress, with leaves curling inward and stems beginning to blacken at the tips. It was like watching months of plant death compressed into days, and I knew that we were running out of time to save anything from our current growing season. But I also noticed something else that morning. The temperature was now low enough that I could see my breath when I exhaled, and the ground was hard beneath my feet in a way that suggested it was beginning to freeze. In all my years of gardening in Los Angeles, I had never had to worry about frost protection or cold weather growing techniques. I was about to learn these skills under the worst possible circumstances, with the lives and nutrition of my entire community depending on how quickly I could adapt. I spent the morning harvesting everything that was still edible, working with a team of volunteers who had arrived early to help with what we all understood might be our last chance to save food from the outdoor gardens. We worked quickly and efficiently, filling crates with tomatoes that weren't quite ripe, peppers that would have been better with another week of growing, and leafy greens that were already starting to show the effects of the ash and cold. As we worked, I found myself thinking about the root cellar that my grandmother had mentioned, about the traditional growing techniques that older community members had offered to teach, about the emergency seed storage that I had been maintaining for years without ever expecting to use it. All of these resources that had seemed like historical curiosities or unlikely contingencies were suddenly the most important things in my world. By the end of the 5th day, I knew that everything was about to change. The world that I had been preparing for, the sustainable agriculture systems that I had been building, the community food security that I had been working toward for years, all of it was based on assumptions about climate and weather and sunlight that were no longer valid. I was going to have to learn entirely new skills, implement techniques that I had never practiced, and lead my community through challenges that none of us had ever imagined. But I also knew that we had resources and knowledge that could help us survive. We had a community that was willing to work together. We had older members who remembered traditional techniques. We had stored seeds and preserved food. We had the foundation of sustainable agriculture systems that could potentially be adapted to new conditions. And we had the determination to figure out how to feed ourselves, no matter what challenges we were facing. That night, As I looked out at the ash-covered garden and the ice-covered windows, I made a commitment to my community and to myself. No matter what was coming, no matter how much the world was changing, I was going to find a way to keep people fed. I was going to adapt every technique I knew, learn every skill I needed, and use every resource available to make sure that our community survived whatever was coming next. The sun had dimmed, the ash was falling, and winter was coming to Los Angeles in October. But we were still here, we were still together, and we were going to find a way to make things grow. The 6th day after Yellowstone erupted was when I truly understood that we were no longer dealing with a temporary crisis. I woke up before dawn to check on the emergency growing setup we had started implementing, and what I found outside made my stomach drop. Every single plant in our main garden was covered with a thick layer of ash that looked like gray concrete when it mixed with the morning dew. The tomato vines that had been our pride and joy were now unrecognizable lumps of vegetation, and the pepper plants looked like they had been dipped in cement and left to dry. But it wasn't just the ash that made me realize how serious our situation had become. The air itself felt different when I breathed, thicker and grittier, like trying to breathe through a dirty filter. My sister Rosa had been right to bring those respirator masks. Within minutes of being outside, I could feel the particles coating the inside of my mouth and making my eyes water. This wasn't just inconvenient weather. This was an environmental change that was going to affect every aspect of how we lived and worked. I spent the morning trying to save what I could from the outdoor gardens, working with a small team of volunteers who had shown up despite the difficult conditions. We used buckets of clean water to try washing the ash off the edible plants, but it was like trying to clean mud with a garden hose. The ash had mixed with the natural moisture on the leaves and formed a paste that was nearly impossible to remove without damaging the plants themselves. Maria, who had been volunteering in our gardens for almost 2 years, started crying as we worked to clean her favorite tomato plants. These weren't just vegetables to her. Her family of 5 depended on the fresh produce from our community gardens to stretch their grocery budget and provide nutrition that they couldn't afford to buy at the store. She was looking at months of carefully tended plants dying in front of her eyes, and she was calculating how much more money she would have to spend on food, money that her family didn't have. I found myself making promises to Maria and the other volunteers that I wasn't completely sure I could keep. I told them that we would find ways to continue growing food indoors, that we would implement emergency techniques to keep the community fed, that this setback wouldn't last forever. But even as I was saying these things, I was looking at the destruction around us and wondering if I was being realistic or just trying to maintain morale in an impossible situation. By mid-morning, we had to abandon the outdoor salvage efforts because the ashfall was increasing and the air quality was becoming dangerous to work in for extended periods. I made the decision to move all our emergency operations indoors, which meant implementing growing techniques that I had studied but never actually practiced on the scale that we would need to feed our community. Rosa had spent the night researching indoor growing systems and emergency food production techniques, and she met me at the community center with printed articles and a notebook full of calculations about space requirements, light sources, and resource allocation. She had been doing the math on how much food we could potentially produce using available indoor spaces, and the numbers were sobering. Even if we converted every available building in our neighborhood into growing space, we would be producing maybe 20% of the fresh food that our community had been getting from the outdoor gardens. The reality of our situation was starting to sink in for everyone involved. We weren't just dealing with a temporary disruption that would be resolved in a few weeks. We were looking at a fundamental change in how our community would produce and access food, and we needed to adapt quickly or face serious nutrition and health problems in the coming months. That afternoon, I called an emergency meeting at the community center to discuss our options and get input from everyone who had been depending on the gardens for their food security. The meeting was more crowded than any gathering we had ever held, with families bringing their children and older community members who had never been directly involved in the gardening work, but who understood that this crisis was going to affect everyone. I stood up in front of the group and gave them the most honest assessment I could manage. I told them that the outdoor gardens were no longer viable, that the ash fall and temperature changes were making it impossible to grow food using our traditional methods. I explained that we were going to have to transition to emergency indoor growing techniques, and that this would mean significantly less fresh produce available for everyone until we could scale up our operations. The questions that people asked during that meeting revealed how quickly our community was starting to understand the broader implications of what was happening. Parents wanted to know how to ensure their children continued getting proper nutrition. Older community members asked about food preservation techniques that could help stretch whatever resources we could produce. Several families asked about the possibility of relocating to areas that weren't being affected by the ashfall. But the question that stuck with me most was from Carlos, who had been one of our most dedicated volunteers. He asked me directly whether I thought the outdoor gardens would ever be viable again, whether we were looking at a temporary crisis or a permanent change to our way of life. I had to tell him honestly that I didn't know, but that we needed to prepare for the possibility that this could last for months or even years. After the meeting, my grandmother approached me and said that she thought it was time to seriously consider opening up the old root cellar behind her house. She explained that her father had designed it not just for food storage, but as a place where the family could continue growing fresh vegetables even during the harshest winter weather. She said that the cellar had natural insulation properties and access to geothermal heat that might make it possible to maintain growing conditions even when the outside temperature continued to drop. That evening, Rosa and I went with my grandmother to examine the root cellar that had been sealed up for decades. The entrance was hidden behind overgrown vegetation and required some serious excavation work to access. But when we finally got the door open, I was amazed by what we found inside. The space was larger than I had expected, with stone walls that had been carefully constructed to maintain stable temperatures and humidity levels. The floor was lined with what looked like original drainage systems, and there were built-in shelving areas that had clearly been designed for food storage and possibly plant cultivation. My grandmother walked through the space like she was remembering childhood visits, pointing out features that her father had explained to her when she was young. She showed us where he had installed ventilation systems that would allow air circulation without losing heat, where he had created water access for irrigation purposes, and where he had set up growing areas that could take advantage of the natural warmth that came from being underground. Standing in that root cellar, I realized that I was looking at technology that was perfectly adapted to the crisis we were facing. This wasn't modern agricultural equipment that required electricity and sophisticated climate control systems. This was a growing environment that had been designed to function independently, to maintain plant-friendly conditions using nothing but careful engineering and natural resources. But I also realized that converting this space into functional growing area was going to require more work and resources than I had initially calculated. We would need to clean and repair systems that had been unused for decades. We would need to figure out lighting solutions that could support photosynthesis without relying on electrical power that might not be available consistently. We would need to develop soil mixtures and growing techniques that were adapted to underground conditions. The seventh day after the eruption was when the supply chain disruptions became impossible to ignore. I went to 3 different grocery stores that morning, trying to find basic supplies for our emergency growing operations, and what I found was shelves that were already showing significant gaps. The produce sections that usually overflowed with fresh fruits and vegetables were nearly empty, with only a few wilted items that looked like they had been sitting in storage for weeks. The store managers I talked to confirmed what I had been afraid of. Transportation networks were being disrupted by the ashfall, which was making it dangerous for trucks to travel through affected areas. Agricultural regions that supplied fresh produce to Los Angeles were reporting massive crop losses, and many farms were suspending operations until air quality improved. Food distribution companies were struggling to maintain their usual schedules and were prioritizing shelf-stable items over fresh produce. But it wasn't just the fresh food that was becoming scarce. Basic gardening supplies like potting soil, fertilizer, and growing containers were also disappearing from store shelves as people throughout the region tried to implement their own emergency growing operations. Seeds that had been readily available just days earlier were now selling out as soon as stores received shipments. I found myself competing with dozens of other people who were all trying to secure the same limited supplies for their own emergency preparations. It was becoming clear that our community wasn't the only group that was recognizing the need to become more self-sufficient in food production. The entire region was waking up to the reality that normal food distribution systems weren't going to be reliable for the foreseeable future. That afternoon, I made the decision to implement rationing protocols for our remaining garden harvest and stored food supplies. This was one of the hardest conversations I had ever had with our community members, because it meant telling families who were already struggling economically that they would have access to even less fresh food than before. But I knew that if we didn't manage our resources carefully, we would run out completely before we could establish alternative growing systems. Rosa helped me organize a fair distribution system based on family size and nutritional needs, with priority given to families with young children, pregnant women, and older community members who had health conditions that required specific dietary considerations. We also established work-sharing requirements, where families who received food from our emergency supplies were expected to contribute labor to our growing operations and community maintenance efforts. The distribution process revealed just how much our community had been depending on the gardens for their basic nutrition. Family after family came to collect their allocated supplies, and I could see in their faces the fear and uncertainty about how they were going to feed themselves in the coming weeks. Some families were already making difficult decisions about which meals to skip, which family members would get priority for the limited fresh food that was available. But I also saw something else during those distributions that gave me hope for our ability to survive this crisis together. People were volunteering to help with tasks they had never done before. Parents were offering to work night shifts monitoring indoor growing operations. Teenagers were volunteering to help with the physically demanding work of converting buildings into growing spaces. Older community members were sharing knowledge about food preservation and traditional cooking techniques that could help stretch our limited resources. The 8th day brought the first real frost that I had ever experienced. In Los Angeles, I woke up to find ice crystals covering every surface outside, including the leaves of plants that had somehow survived the ashfall. The temperature had dropped to 32 degrees overnight, which meant that any hope of salvaging plants from our outdoor gardens was now completely gone. We were officially in emergency survival mode. But the frost also confirmed something that my grandmother had been predicting based on her family's traditional weather knowledge. She had been watching the sky patterns and temperature changes, and she had told me that we were looking at the beginning of a winter that would be unlike anything our region had experienced in modern times. She predicted that the temperature would continue dropping, and that we could expect freezing conditions to persist for months, rather than the few days of cold weather that Los Angeles usually experienced. I spent that morning implementing the first phase of our underground growing operation, working with a team of volunteers to move our most valuable seeds and seedling trays into the root cellar. The work was physically demanding and technically challenging because we had to figure out lighting, ventilation, and irrigation systems that could function in the underground environment without relying on electrical power that might not be consistently available. My grandmother proved to be invaluable during this process because she remembered details about how her father had operated similar systems during the Depression. She showed us how to create reflective surfaces that could maximize the effectiveness of limited light sources, how to set up drainage systems that would prevent water from pooling and creating fungal problems, and how to arrange growing containers to take advantage of the natural air circulation patterns in the underground space. But even as we were making progress on the technical aspects of underground growing, I was becoming increasingly aware of the social and organizational challenges that we were going to face. Managing food production for over 200 families, using techniques that none of us had ever practiced before, was going to require levels of coordination and cooperation that we had never needed during our normal operations. The 9th day was when we experienced our first conflict over resource allocation. Two families who had been depending on our gardens for most of their fresh produce got into an argument over the distribution of the remaining tomatoes from our emergency harvest. The argument escalated quickly, with accusations about who had contributed more labor to the gardens and who deserved priority access to the limited food that was available. I found myself in the position of mediating disputes between people who were scared, hungry, and facing an uncertain future. These were families who had been working together cooperatively for years, but the stress of the crisis was bringing out tensions and conflicts that had been manageable when resources were more abundant. Rosa suggested that we needed to establish formal governance structures for our emergency operations, with clear rules about resource allocation, work requirements, and conflict resolution procedures. She pointed out that the informal systems that had worked fine for managing community gardens weren't going to be adequate for managing survival operations that would determine whether families had enough food to stay healthy. That afternoon, we held our second emergency community meeting to establish formal protocols for our crisis response operations. The discussions were more intense and sometimes heated than any previous community meetings, because people were now making decisions that would directly affect their family's ability to survive the coming months. We established committees for different aspects of our emergency operations: resource management, food production, security and safety, communication and coordination with other communities. Each committee had representatives from different families, and each family was required to contribute labor to multiple aspects of our survival efforts. But the most important decision we made during that meeting was to formally commit to staying together as a community rather than allowing families to scatter to look for resources elsewhere. Several families had been considering relocating to areas that might not be as severely affected by the ash fall, but we collectively decided that our best chance of survival was to pool our resources and knowledge to create sustainable local food production systems. The 10th day brought news that made it clear we were facing a regional crisis rather than just local problems. Radio reports confirmed that the ash cloud was continuing to spread and intensify, affecting agricultural areas throughout California and neighboring states. Food distribution networks were failing across the western United States, and government emergency services were becoming overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. But the radio reports also included information that gave me hope for our long-term survival strategy. Other communities were successfully implementing emergency growing operations using techniques similar to what we were developing: underground growing systems, traditional preservation methods, and community cooperation were proving effective in areas that had been proactive about adapting to the changed conditions. I realized that the knowledge and skills we were developing weren't just important for our own community's survival. We were part of a larger network of people who were figuring out how to maintain food production and community stability under conditions that modern agricultural systems weren't designed to handle. The techniques that we were learning and the social systems that we were developing could potentially be shared with other communities facing similar challenges. That afternoon, I made the decision to document everything we were learning about emergency food production and community organization during crisis conditions. Rosa started taking detailed notes about our growing techniques, resource management, protocols, and social organization systems. We realized that this information could be valuable for other communities, and that our survival might depend partly on our ability to trade knowledge and resources with other groups who were facing similar challenges. The 11th day was when I truly understood how much our community had changed in less than 2 weeks. I was working in the root cellar with a team of volunteers, setting up the growing systems that would determine whether we could produce enough fresh food to keep everyone healthy through the winter. The work was physically demanding and technically complex, requiring skills that none of us had possessed just days earlier. But as I looked around at the people working alongside me, I realized that we had already become something different. From the community gardening group that we had been before the eruption, we were now a survival community with formal leadership structures, resource allocation protocols, and work requirements that were based on our collective need to stay alive rather than our individual interests in gardening as a hobby or supplement to purchased food. The transformation wasn't just organizational, it was personal. I was no longer just someone who knew how to grow vegetables and teach sustainable agriculture techniques. I had become someone who was responsible for keeping over 200 people fed under conditions that challenged everything I thought I knew about food production. The decisions I made about seed allocation, growing techniques, and resource management were now matters of life and death for families who trusted me to figure out solutions to problems that none of us had ever imagined facing. My grandmother spent that day teaching a group of community members traditional food preservation techniques that could help us extend the nutritional value and storage life of whatever food we were able to produce. She showed them how to make fermented vegetables that would provide vitamins and minerals during periods when fresh produce wasn't available, how to dry and store foods without refrigeration, and how to prepare nutritious meals using ingredients that most people would consider scraps or waste. Watching her share this knowledge with people who were eager to learn skills they had never needed before, I realized that we were experiencing a kind of cultural reversal. Techniques that had been considered obsolete or unnecessary in our modern agricultural system were now becoming essential survival skills. The knowledge that older community members had inherited from previous generations was suddenly more valuable than the modern techniques that I had spent years studying and implementing. The 12th day brought our first major test of the community governance systems we had established. A family of 4 who had not been regular participants in our community gardens showed up requesting access to our emergency food supplies. They had heard through neighborhood networks that we were providing food for community members, and they were facing the same supply chain disruptions and economic pressures that were affecting everyone in the region. The situation created a difficult dilemma for our resource allocation committee. Our emergency supplies were calculated based on providing for the families who had been contributing to our gardens and who were now contributing labor to our survival operations. Adding additional families would mean less food for everyone. But turning away hungry neighbors felt morally wrong and potentially dangerous from a security standpoint. After several hours of discussion, we decided to integrate the new family into our community operations, but with clear expectations about their contribution to our collective survival efforts. They would be expected to contribute labor to our growing operations, participate in our resource management systems, and follow the same protocols that everyone else was following for food allocation and community decision-making. This decision established a precedent that would become important as more families in our neighborhood began facing food security problems. We were committed to helping as many people as possible, but only within the framework of collective responsibility and shared labor that was necessary for our survival operations to remain sustainable. That evening, Rosa and I spent time calculating our food production projections based on the growing systems we were implementing and the resources we had available. The numbers were challenging, but not impossible. If we could successfully scale up our underground growing operations, implement effective food preservation techniques, and maintain the level of community cooperation we had achieved so far, we could potentially produce enough nutrition to keep everyone healthy through the winter months. But the calculations also made it clear that we were going to be living on the edge of food security for months. There would be no surplus, no buffer for mistakes or equipment failures, no room for the kind of waste or inefficiency that had been acceptable when food was abundant and affordable. Every seed would need to be planted optimally, every harvest would need to be preserved effectively, and every community member would need to contribute their full effort to our collective survival. As we moved into the second week since the eruption, I found myself thinking constantly about the changes that were still coming. The ashfall was continuing, the temperature was still dropping, and radio reports suggested that the worst effects of the volcanic winter were still ahead of us. We had successfully adapted to the immediate crisis, but we were going to need to continue adapting and evolving our systems to survive challenges that we couldn't yet fully anticipate. The most important thing we had accomplished during those first 12 days wasn't just the technical aspects of emergency food production. We had successfully transformed from a group of individuals who shared an interest in community gardening into a functioning survival community with the social organization and collective commitment necessary to keep everyone alive during an extended crisis. But I also knew that our biggest challenges were still ahead of us. The social systems we had developed were working under relatively calm conditions, but they would be tested much more severely as resources became scarcer and external pressures increased. The growing techniques we were implementing were based on theory and limited experience, and we wouldn't know whether they were truly effective until we had been operating them for months. Most importantly, we were still isolated from broader networks of information and resources that could help us understand what was happening in other parts of the region and what strategies were proving most effective for long-term survival. We were making decisions based on limited information and hoping that our adaptations would be sufficient for challenges that we couldn't fully predict or prepare for. As I fell asleep on the 12th night, I was thinking about my grandfather's stories that my grandmother had been sharing with us as we worked to implement traditional growing and preservation techniques. He had survived the Depression by combining traditional knowledge with innovative adaptations to changing conditions. He had maintained hope and community solidarity during years of economic and social crisis that had destroyed many communities that weren't as well prepared or organized. I realized that we were now living through our own version of the challenges that previous generations had faced, and that our survival would depend on our ability to combine the wisdom of traditional techniques with the innovation necessary to adapt to conditions that were unprecedented in modern times. We were no longer just growing food for our community. We were figuring out how to maintain human community and dignity under conditions that were testing every assumption about how modern life was supposed to work. The ash was still falling, the temperature was still dropping, and we had no idea how long the crisis would last or how much worse it would get. But we were still together. We were still finding ways to feed ourselves, and we were still committed to figuring out whatever solutions would be necessary to keep our community alive and functioning. That commitment was going to have to be enough to carry us through whatever was coming next. The 13th day after Yellowstone erupted was when the power grid finally failed completely. I woke up in darkness to the sound of my neighbor pounding on my door, telling me that the electricity had gone out during the night and wasn't coming back on. When I checked my phone, I found that the cell towers were down too, which meant we had lost our primary means of communication with the outside world and our ability to coordinate with other communities that might be facing similar challenges. The power failure wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a catastrophic blow to our emergency growing operations that had been depending on electric heating systems, grow lights, and water pumps to maintain the underground growing environment we had been developing in my grandfather's root cellar. Without electricity, the temperature in our growing spaces would drop to match the outside air, which was now consistently below freezing even during the daytime hours. I spent that morning working with Rosa and a team of volunteers to implement backup systems that could function without electrical power. We had been preparing for this possibility, but actually implementing manual heating, lighting, and irrigation systems under crisis conditions was much more challenging than we had anticipated. Every system that we had been taking for granted now required human labor, constant monitoring, and creative problem solving to maintain basic functionality. The heating challenge was the most critical issue we faced. The seedlings and young plants that we had been nurturing in the underground space would die within hours if we couldn't maintain temperatures above freezing. We implemented a system using candles, oil lamps, and small fires in metal containers to provide heat. But managing these heat sources required constant attention to prevent carbon monoxide buildup and fire hazards in the enclosed space. My grandmother proved invaluable during this crisis because she remembered how her father had operated the root cellar systems during the Depression when electricity wasn't available in their neighborhood. She showed us how to create ventilation systems that could provide fresh air while retaining heat, how to position heat sources to create optimal temperature distribution, and how to monitor plant health under conditions that were far from ideal for growing operations. By the end of that first day without power, we had managed to keep our growing systems operational, but I realized that we were now operating with much smaller margins for error. Every aspect of our food production required more human labor, more constant attention, and more precise coordination than before. We were essentially running a complex agricultural operation using 19th century technology, and any mistakes could result in losing the plants that our community was depending on for survival. The 14th day brought news that confirmed our worst fears about the broader regional situation. A battery-powered radio that Carlos had brought from his house picked up emergency broadcasts reporting that the power grid failures were affecting the entire western United States. Food distribution networks had collapsed completely, and government emergency services were unable to provide assistance to most affected communities. But the radio reports also included information that gave me hope for our long-term survival. Strategy. Communities that had successfully implemented independent food production and heating systems were weathering the crisis much better than areas that had been depending on external supply chains and centralized power systems. The techniques we were developing weren't just keeping us alive. They were putting us ahead of most other communities in terms of our ability to adapt to the new conditions. That afternoon, I made the decision to expand our underground growing operations beyond the original root cellar. We had identified several other buildings in our neighborhood that had basement spaces or underground areas that could potentially be converted into growing environments. The work would be physically demanding and technically challenging, but increasing our production capacity was essential for feeding the growing number of families who were joining our community operations. The expansion project revealed skills and knowledge within our community that I hadn't known existed. Miguel, who worked as a construction supervisor, had extensive experience with underground spaces and ventilation systems. Sarah, who had been quiet during most of our previous meetings, turned out to know traditional techniques for creating growing soil from compost and organic materials. Even some of the teenagers who had seemed uninterested in gardening work proved to have valuable skills in problem solving and manual labor. But the expansion also created new challenges for our resource allocation and community governance systems. Each new growing space required materials, labor, and ongoing maintenance that stretched our available resources. We had to make difficult decisions about which projects to prioritize and which families would be responsible for maintaining different aspects of our survival operations. The 15th day was when we encountered our first serious conflict with people from outside our immediate community. A group of about 20 people from a neighborhood several miles away arrived at our main growing site, demanding access to our food supplies and shelter spaces. They had heard through word-of-mouth networks that we were successfully maintaining food production while other communities were struggling with hunger and cold. The situation was tense from the beginning because these weren't people who had been part of our community development efforts or who understood the cooperative principles that our survival operations were based on. They were desperate families who had been unable to secure adequate food and shelter, and they were looking for immediate solutions to their crisis rather than long-term community integration. I found myself in the position of negotiating with people who were scared, hungry, and potentially dangerous if they felt that their family's survival was threatened. The conversation was complicated by the fact that our own community members were watching to see how I would handle a situation that could set precedents for future interactions with outside groups. After several hours of discussion, we reached an agreement that allowed the new families to access our emergency food supplies and shelter spaces, but only within the framework of contributing to our collective survival efforts. They would be expected to provide labor for our growing operations, follow our resource allocation protocols, and participate in our community decision-making processes, just like everyone else who was part of our survival community, but integrating 20 new people into our operations created immediate practical challenges. Our food production calculations had been based on supporting the families who were already part of our community, and adding new people meant that everyone would have less access to fresh food until we could scale up our growing operations. Our shelter spaces were now overcrowded, and our social systems were strained by having to accommodate people who didn't understand or necessarily accept the cooperative principles that our community was based on. The 16th day brought the first serious test of our expanded community's ability to work together under pressure. One of the new families complained that they were being given less food than families who had been part of our original community, and they accused us of operating an unfair system that privileged some people over others based on how long they had been involved in our operations. The complaint led to a community meeting that was more heated and divisive than any discussion we had held before. Some of the original community members felt that people who had contributed labor and resources to building our survival systems should have priority access to the food and shelter that those systems provided. Some of the newer families felt that survival resources should be distributed based purely on need, especially for families with young children or elderly members. Rosa took the lead in facilitating the discussion because she had more experience than I did in managing conflicts between people with different perspectives and interests. She helped us work through a resource allocation system that balanced fairness with the practical requirements of maintaining our food production and community operations. The resolution we reached wasn't perfect, but it established principles that would guide our community for the remainder of the crisis. Food allocation would be based primarily on nutritional need, with priority for children, pregnant women, and people with health conditions that required specific dietary considerations. But everyone who received food from our community supplies would be expected to contribute labor to our collective operations based on their ability and availability. The 17th day was when I realized that our community had evolved beyond anything I had imagined when we first started implementing emergency growing techniques. We were now supporting almost 60 families, operating multiple underground growing facilities, and managing complex social systems that required constant coordination and problem-solving. My role had changed dramatically from the community gardener I had been just 2 weeks earlier. I was now essentially the coordinator of a small survival town, responsible for making decisions about resource allocation, work assignments, security protocols, and long-term planning that affected the lives of over 200 people. The weight of that responsibility was sometimes overwhelming, especially when I was making decisions based on incomplete information and uncertain projections about future conditions. But I was also discovering leadership capabilities within our community that I hadn't recognized before. Rosa had become our primary coordinator for social organization and conflict resolution. Miguel was managing the technical aspects of our growing operations and building maintenance. Sarah was overseeing food preservation and meal preparation, systems that were keeping everyone fed despite our limited resources. Most importantly, my grandmother had become the unofficial wisdom keeper and morale coordinator for our entire community. She spent her days moving between different work groups, sharing traditional knowledge, helping resolve interpersonal conflicts, and maintaining the sense of hope and collective purpose that was essential for our survival operations to continue functioning. The 18th day brought our first major failure in the underground growing systems. A ventilation problem in one of our newer growing spaces led to a fungal infection that destroyed an entire crop of leafy greens that we had been counting on for nutritional support over the next several weeks. The loss represented not just food that we wouldn't have available, but also seeds, labor, and growing space that we couldn't easily replace. The crop failure was devastating for community morale because it demonstrated how vulnerable our survival operations were to technical problems and mistakes. We were operating with no buffer for losses, no backup systems for critical growing operations, and no access to replacement materials if our equipment failed or our techniques proved inadequate. But the failure also revealed the resilience and problem-solving capabilities that our community had developed over the previous weeks. Instead of panicking or giving up, people immediately began working on solutions. We implemented stronger ventilation systems in our other growing spaces, developed backup plans for replacing lost food production, and created monitoring protocols that would help us identify and address problems before they became catastrophic. That evening, I spent time with my grandmother, asking her about the most difficult periods that her family had survived during the Depression and how they had maintained hope and community solidarity when their survival efforts experienced setbacks. She told me that the key was understanding that survival was a long-term process that would involve failures and disappointments, along with successes. She said that her father had always taught their family that the goal wasn't to avoid all problems or to have perfect systems, but to develop the resilience and adaptability necessary to recover from setbacks and continue working toward long-term survival. She said that the families who had survived the Depression were the ones who had learned to treat failures as learning opportunities rather than as reasons to give up on their survival efforts. The 19th day was when we received our first communication from other survival communities in the region. A man named David, who had been traveling between different communities on a bicycle, arrived with messages from groups that were implementing similar emergency food production and social organization systems throughout the Los Angeles area. The information David brought was both encouraging and sobering. Several communities were successfully maintaining food production and social stability using techniques similar to what we had developed. But many other communities had failed to adapt to the changed conditions, and their members were now joining the growing population of refugees who were traveling between areas looking for food and shelter. David also brought news about the broader regional situation that helped us understand the context for our survival efforts. The ashfall was continuing and intensifying, with some areas now experiencing complete darkness during daytime hours. Temperature drops were affecting regions that had never experienced freezing weather, and food production throughout the western United States had essentially stopped. But perhaps most importantly, David brought information about emerging trade networks between survival communities. Groups that had successfully implemented food production systems were beginning to exchange resources, knowledge, and labor with other communities. Seeds preserved food, tools, and technical expertise were being traded through informal networks that were developing independent of the failed government and commercial systems. The 20th day was when I realized that our community's survival strategy needed to extend beyond just maintaining our own food production and social organization. We needed to develop relationships with other successful communities that could provide mutual support, shared resources, and backup systems that would help us weather crises that might overwhelm our individual capacity. I spent that day working with Rosa and several other community leaders to develop a communication and trade strategy that would connect us with other survival communities without compromising our security or resource allocation systems. We needed to balance the benefits of collaboration with other groups against the risks of attracting attention from hostile communities or government agencies that might try to requisition our resources. The planning process revealed that we had developed resources and capabilities that would be valuable for trade with other communities. Our seed collection included varieties that were particularly well adapted to cold weather growing conditions. Our food preservation techniques were producing nutritious supplies that could be stored and transported. Our social organization systems were maintaining community stability and cooperation under conditions that were destroying many other groups. But we also identified resources and knowledge that we needed from other communities. Medical supplies and expertise for treating health problems that were becoming more common under the stress of our survival conditions. Technical knowledge about advanced growing techniques that could improve our food production efficiency. Information about long-term planning strategies that could help us adapt to conditions that might persist for years. The 21st day brought Rosa back from her first trading expedition to other communities in our region. She had been gone for 3 days, traveling with David and several other community representatives to establish communication networks and explore possibilities for resource sharing and mutual support. The information she brought back was both hopeful and concerning. She had found several communities that were successfully implementing survival strategies similar to ours, and she had established agreements for sharing seeds, preserved food, and technical knowledge. She had also identified communities that were struggling and might benefit from our expertise in emergency food production and social organization. But Rosa also reported that the regional situation was more dangerous than we had understood. Some communities had turned to raiding and theft as their primary survival strategy, targeting successful groups like ours for their resources and shelter facilities. Government emergency services had essentially collapsed, and there were no reliable security or law enforcement systems operating in most areas. Most concerning, Rosa had learned that our community's success had made us visible to groups that might view our resources as targets for acquisition. Word was spreading through refugee networks that we were maintaining food production and accepting new members, which meant that we could expect increasing numbers of people seeking access to our community, including some who might not be interested in contributing to our cooperative survival efforts. The 22nd day was when we had our first encounter with a group that was clearly interested in taking our resources rather than contributing to our community operations. 6 men arrived at our main growing site, claiming to be representatives of a regional security organization that was providing protection services to survival communities in exchange for food and resource tribute. The men were armed and made it clear that they viewed our resources as available for their use rather than as belonging to our community. They demanded access to our food supplies, our shelter facilities, and our growing operations, implying that communities that didn't cooperate with their organization would not receive protection from other hostile groups in the region. I found myself in the most dangerous situation I had faced since the crisis began. These weren't desperate families seeking food and shelter. They were organized individuals who were using the collapse of normal social systems as an opportunity to extract resources from communities that had been successful in adapting to the changed conditions. The negotiation lasted several hours, with our entire community watching to see how I would handle a situation that could determine whether we maintained our independence or became subordinate to an external organization that might not share our cooperative principles. I had to balance the immediate threat to our security against the long-term implications of submitting to tribute demands that could escalate over time. The resolution came when several members of our community made it clear that they were prepared to defend our resources and independence. Miguel and Carlos had organized a group of our strongest members to provide visible backup during the negotiation, and some of the families who had joined us from other communities shared information about the reputation and capabilities of the group that was making demands. Eventually, the men agreed to leave our community alone in exchange for a one-time contribution of preserved food and information about other communities in the region. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it bought us time to develop better security protocols and to strengthen our relationships with other communities that might provide mutual protection against future threats. The 23rd day was when I realized that our survival community had reached a critical transition point. We were no longer just focused on emergency food production and basic survival. We were developing the social organization, security protocols, and external relationships that would determine whether we could maintain our independence and cooperative principles under conditions that were becoming increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. That evening, I called a community meeting to discuss our options for long-term security and survival strategy. The discussion was more serious and focused than any conversation we had held before, because people understood that the decisions we made would determine not just whether we survived the immediate crisis, but what kind of community we would become as we adapted to conditions that might persist for years. The meeting revealed that our community had developed a strong commitment to maintaining our cooperative principles and democratic decision-making processes, even under conditions that might seem to require more authoritarian leadership structures. People were willing to accept risks to their individual security in order to preserve the social systems that had made our survival possible. But the meeting also revealed that we needed to develop more sophisticated strategies for managing our relationships with external groups and for protecting our resources and community members from threats that were likely to increase as regional conditions continued to deteriorate. We were going to have to become more than just a successful survival community. We were going to have to become a functioning town with the capacity to defend itself and to maintain social stability under conditions that were testing every assumption about how human communities could organize themselves. As I prepared for sleep on the 23rd night, I found myself thinking about how much had changed since that first morning when I had been kneeling in the tomato beds, worried about nothing more serious than the late-season harvest and the upcoming winter planting schedule. In less than 3 weeks, I had learned to operate underground growing systems using 19th-century technology, to manage resource allocation for over 200 people, and to negotiate with armed groups who viewed our success as an opportunity for their own benefit. But I had also learned that human communities were capable of adapting to conditions that seemed impossible and of maintaining cooperation and mutual support under circumstances that might seem to require competition and conflict. Our survival wasn't just a matter of technical knowledge about growing food or managing resources. It was a matter of social organization and collective commitment that allowed us to function as a community, rather than as individuals competing for scarce resources. The power was still out, the ash was still falling, and the temperature was still dropping. But we were still together, we were still finding ways to feed ourselves, and we were still committed to maintaining the cooperative principles that had made our survival possible. That commitment was going to have to be enough to carry us through whatever challenges were still ahead of us. The 24th day after Yellowstone erupted was when my sister Rosa disappeared. She had volunteered to lead a scouting expedition to establish contact with a community about 15 miles south of us, that David had mentioned during his trading visit. The plan was for her to be gone for 2 days, returning with information about potential resource-sharing agreements and mutual defense, partnerships that could strengthen our security position. When the second day passed without any sign of Rosa, or the 3 community members who had accompanied her on the expedition, I knew something had gone seriously wrong. Rosa was experienced in traveling between communities and had proven herself capable of handling difficult negotiations and dangerous situations. She wouldn't have been delayed by weather or technical problems without finding a way to send word back to us about her status. I spent that morning organizing search parties while trying to maintain the normal operations that our community depended on for survival. Miguel took charge of the underground growing systems. Sarah coordinated food preparation and preservation work, and my grandmother provided the steady leadership presence that kept everyone focused on their essential tasks despite the growing anxiety about Rosa's disappearance. The search parties returned that evening with disturbing news. They had found evidence of a struggle at a location about halfway between our community and the destination Rosa had been traveling toward. Personal belongings that belonged to Rosa and her companions were scattered around an area that showed signs of a violent confrontation, but there were no bodies and no clear indication of what had happened to our people. But the search teams had also discovered something else that made Rosa's disappearance even more ominous. They had encountered other travelers who reported that several communities in our region had been raided by organized groups that were capturing people with valuable skills rather than just stealing resources. Communities that had successfully developed food production or technical capabilities were being targeted by groups that wanted to acquire those capabilities for their own operations. The 25th day was when I had to make one of the most difficult decisions of the entire crisis. I could organize a larger search and rescue operation that might help us find Rosa and her companions, but that would require taking essential people away from our survival operations and potentially exposing them to the same dangers that had apparently captured our first expedition. Or I could focus on protecting our existing community while hoping that Rosa and her companions would find a way to return on their own. The decision was complicated by the fact that Rosa wasn't just my sister. She had become one of our most essential community leaders, with knowledge about our resource allocation systems, our trade relationships, and our long-term planning strategies that would be difficult to replace. Losing her permanently would be devastating, not just personally, but for our community's ability to continue functioning effectively. After consulting with our community leadership committee, I made the decision to send one small, highly capable team to gather intelligence about Rosa's situation while maintaining our essential community operations. Carlos volunteered to lead this intelligence mission, taking with him 2 other community members who had proven themselves skilled at traveling safely and gathering information without attracting dangerous attention. That same day we received an unexpected visitor who brought information that changed our understanding of Rosa's disappearance and the broader threats facing our community. A woman named Elena arrived at our main growing site, claiming to be a representative of a group that called itself the Central Valley Alliance, which was apparently attempting to organize mutual defense and resource sharing among successful survival communities throughout our region. Elena explained that Rosa and her companions had been captured by a group that was systematically targeting communities with successful food production operations. This group wasn't interested in temporary raids or tribute extraction. They were attempting to build a larger organization by forcibly integrating smaller communities and their resources into a centralized system that they controlled. According to Elena, Rosa and her companions were being held at a facility about 30 miles from our location, along with representatives from several other communities who had been captured during similar expeditions. The group holding them was using the captured community leaders as leverage to force their home communities to submit to integration into their larger organization. Elena's group was proposing a coordinated response that would involve multiple communities working together to rescue the captured leaders and to establish a defensive alliance that could resist future attempts at forced integration by hostile organizations. She was asking our community to contribute people and resources to this joint operation, which would be risky but might be our only opportunity to recover Rosa and to establish the regional security partnerships that we needed for long-term survival. The 26th day was when I realized that our community had reached a decision point that would determine not just Rosa's fate, but our fundamental approach to survival in the post-eruption world. We could continue trying to maintain our independence and security through isolation and defensive measures, or we could accept the risks involved in joining with other communities to create larger-scale organizations that might be more capable of providing mutual protection and resource sharing. After a full day of community meetings and discussions, we decided to participate in Elena's proposed rescue operation. We would contribute 6 of our most capable people to the joint effort, along with preserved food supplies and equipment that the operation would require. In exchange, we would gain membership in the Central Valley Alliance and access to the mutual defense and resource sharing networks that the Alliance was developing. The decision wasn't unanimous, and some community members were concerned that we were risking our security and independence by getting involved in conflicts with external organizations. But the majority of our community felt that Rosa's leadership was essential for our long-term survival, and that the regional security situation was becoming too dangerous for small communities to handle independently. I found myself preparing for the most dangerous mission I had ever undertaken. The rescue operation would require traveling to unfamiliar territory, coordinating with people I had never worked with before, and potentially engaging in armed conflict with a group that had proven itself capable of capturing experienced travelers and community leaders. My grandmother spent that evening sharing with me the stories about her father's experiences during the most dangerous periods of the Depression, when communities had to organize themselves to resist groups that were trying to exploit the economic collapse for their own benefit. She told me that survival during crisis periods often required taking risks that seemed unreasonable under normal circumstances, but that the alternative to taking those risks was often accepting conditions that made long-term survival impossible. The 27th day was when the rescue operation began. I left our community in the hands of Miguel, Sarah, and my grandmother, trusting that the leadership systems we had developed would keep our survival operations functioning during my absence, and hoping that I would return with Rosa and the other captured community leaders who had become pawns in a larger conflict about how human communities would organize themselves in the post-eruption world. The joint operation involved representatives from 7 different communities, coordinated by Elena's Central Valley Alliance. The plan was complex and risky, requiring precise timing and coordination between groups that had never worked together before. We would approach the facility where the captured leaders were being held from multiple directions, creating diversions that would allow small teams to extract our people while larger groups provided security and backup support. The operation revealed capabilities and resources within the Alliance network that I hadn't known existed. Some communities had developed sophisticated communication systems that allowed coordination over long distances. Others had members with military or security experience who understood tactical planning and execution. Several groups had managed to maintain vehicles and fuel supplies that provided mobility advantages in the post-eruption environment. But the operation also revealed the level of organization and capability of the group that had been capturing community leaders. Their facility was well defended and systematically organized, with security protocols that suggested they had been planning and implementing their expansion strategy for weeks or months. They weren't just opportunistic raiders. They were a functioning organization with long-term goals and the resources to achieve them. The rescue mission succeeded, but not without casualties and Complications that made it clear that we were now involved in a broader conflict that would continue long after. Rosa and the other captured leaders were safely returned to their communities. The group that had been holding them had resources and capabilities that suggested they would continue expanding their operations, and they would likely target Alliance communities for retaliation in response to the successful rescue operation. Rosa returned with information about the organization that had captured her, information that changed our understanding of the threats and opportunities facing survival communities throughout our region. The group called itself the New California Collective, and they were attempting to create a centralized survival organization that would eventually control food production, resource allocation, and population movement throughout the Western United States. According to Rosa, the New California Collective had been planning their expansion strategy since the early days after the eruption, recruiting members with military, technical, and organizational experience who could implement a coordinated, systematic approach to consolidating control over successful survival communities. They viewed the post-eruption period as an opportunity to create new forms of social organization that would be more efficient and controllable than the democratic and cooperative systems that many communities had been developing. The 28th day was when I realized that our community's survival was now permanently connected to broader regional conflicts about how human societies would reorganize themselves in response to the climate catastrophe that the eruption had created. We couldn't maintain our independence and security by focusing only on our own food production and community organization. We were going to have to choose sides in a larger struggle between different approaches to post-catastrophe social organization. The Central Valley Alliance represented communities that were committed to maintaining democratic decision-making processes and cooperative resource sharing, even under conditions that made these approaches more difficult and risky. The New California Collective represented a more centralized and hierarchical approach that might be more efficient in some ways, but that would require individual communities to surrender their autonomy and self-determination. Our participation in the rescue operation had essentially committed us to the Alliance approach, but it had also made us a target for future operations by the Formation, by the Collective and other groups that viewed successful independent communities as threats to their expansion strategies. We were no longer just trying to survive the immediate effects of the volcanic winter. We were helping to determine what kinds of human communities would emerge from the crisis. That evening, Rosa and I spent time planning our community's role in the Alliance network and our strategies for contributing to mutual defense and resource sharing while maintaining the cooperative principles and democratic processes that had made our own survival possible. We were going to have to become more than just a successful survival community. We were going to have to become active participants in creating the social and political systems that would replace the governmental and economic structures that had collapsed along with the normal climate patterns. As I prepared for sleep on the 28th night, I found myself thinking about how the challenges we were facing had evolved from technical problems about growing food without sunlight to fundamental questions about how human communities could organize themselves under conditions that made traditional social institutions unreliable or impossible to maintain. The rescue operation had succeeded, but it had also committed us to ongoing involvement in conflicts that were larger and more dangerous than anything I had imagined when I first started trying to figure out how to keep my community fed after the ash started falling. We were no longer just gardeners who had learned emergency survival techniques. We were active participants in determining what kinds of human societies would survive and flourish in the world that was emerging from the volcanic winter that had begun 28 days earlier. The 29th day after Yellowstone erupted was when the New California Collective arrived at our community with a force that made it clear they weren't interested in negotiation or gradual integration. I woke up to Carlos shaking me urgently, telling me that armed vehicles were approaching our main growing site and that we had maybe 20 minutes to decide how we were going to respond to what appeared to be a full-scale occupation attempt. Through the early morning light filtered by the persistent ash cloud, I could see a convoy of modified trucks and SUVs carrying what looked like 40 to 50 people, many of them clearly armed and organized in a way that suggested military or security experience. This wasn't a raiding party or a tribute collection expedition. This was a force that was prepared to take control of our community operations and integrate our resources into their expanding organizational structure. Rosa and I quickly gathered our community leadership committee to assess our options. We could attempt to resist the occupation, which would likely result in casualties and might not be successful given the size and apparent capability of the approaching force. We could attempt to negotiate terms for integration that might preserve some of our community autonomy and cooperative principles. Or we could implement the evacuation plan that we had developed as a contingency for exactly this kind of situation. The decision had to be made quickly because the collective forces were already positioning themselves around our primary facilities and beginning to establish control over our food production and storage areas. I realized that the rescue operation we had participated in just 2 days earlier had accelerated their timeline for consolidating control over Alliance communities, and that we were now facing the consequences of our decision to resist their expansion strategy. I made the choice to attempt negotiation first, hoping that we could find terms that would allow our community to maintain its essential character while avoiding the casualties and destruction that would result from armed resistance. I walked out to meet the collective representatives, accompanied by Rosa and Miguel, leaving Sarah and my grandmother to coordinate our community's response based on how the negotiations developed. The collective leader was a woman named Commander Martinez, who had clearly been chosen for this operation because of her experience in military organization and her ability to project authority in challenging situations. She explained that the collective viewed our community as a valuable asset that could contribute to their regional survival strategy, but that our recent participation in Alliance activities had made voluntary integration unlikely. Martinez offered us what she described as generous terms for joining the collective. Our community would retain local autonomy over day-to-day operations. Our food production systems would be enhanced with resources and technical expertise that the collective had access to, and our members would gain access to medical care, security, protection, and trade networks that extended throughout the western United States. But the terms also required us to surrender our independent decision-making authority to the collective leadership structure, to contribute a significant portion of our food production to support other collective operations, and to accept the assignment of collective supervisors who would oversee our operations and ensure our compliance with centralized policies and procedures. I found myself in the position of negotiating for the future of over 200 people who had trusted me to lead them through the crisis, while facing a force that had the capability to simply take control of our community, regardless of what we decided. The conversation was civil but tense, with both sides understanding that the outcome would determine not just our immediate security, but our long-term survival as a functioning community. After 2 hours of discussion, I requested time to consult with our community before making a final decision. Martinez agreed to give us until the end of the day, but made it clear that the collective forces would remain in position around our facilities and that any attempt to evacuate or resist would be considered an hostile act that would result in immediate occupation. I spent the afternoon in the most intense community meeting we had ever held, discussing options that would determine the fundamental nature of our survival strategy for the foreseeable future. The discussion revealed divisions within our community that had been manageable during our earlier crises, but that now threatened to split us apart when we most needed unity and collective decision-making. Some community members argued that joining the collective was our best option for long-term survival, given their apparent resources and organizational capabilities. Others insisted that surrendering our autonomy would destroy the cooperative principles that had made our survival possible in the first place. A few families suggested that we should attempt to evacuate to other alliance communities, even though that would mean abandoning the growing operations and shelter facilities that we had worked so hard to create. My grandmother provided the perspective that ultimately shaped our decision. She reminded us that her family had faced similar choices during the Depression, when various organizations had offered security and resources in exchange for surrendering community autonomy and individual freedom. She said that the families who had accepted those offers had initially appeared to be more secure and prosperous, but that over time they had lost the resilience and adaptability that were essential for surviving extended periods of crisis and uncertainty. She suggested that our community's strength came not from our technical capabilities or our resource allocation systems, but from our commitment to cooperative decision-making and mutual responsibility that allowed us to adapt to changing conditions and to maintain hope and solidarity even under the most difficult circumstances. She warned that surrendering those principles for the promise of external security and resources would ultimately make us weaker and less capable of surviving whatever challenges were still ahead of us. After hours of discussion, our community voted to reject the collective's integration offer and to implement our evacuation plan. We would abandon our current facilities and growing operations, taking with us the seeds, preserved food, and portable equipment that we could carry, and attempt to relocate to territory that was controlled by alliance communities that shared our commitment to cooperative survival strategies. The decision was heartbreaking because it meant leaving behind the underground growing systems that we had worked so hard to create and that had kept us fed through the most difficult weeks of the crisis. But it also represented our community's commitment to maintaining the principles and relationships that had made our survival possible, even at the cost of material security and immediate comfort. That evening, we implemented the evacuation plan that Rosa had developed weeks earlier as a contingency for exactly this situation. Working quickly and quietly, we packed essential supplies and equipment into portable containers, destroyed sensitive information about our growing techniques and resource locations, and prepared to leave the facilities that had been our home and sanctuary since the early days of the crisis. The evacuation was coordinated through communication networks that Elena's Central Valley Alliance had established, with alliance communities providing safe passage routes and temporary shelter, locations that would allow us to relocate without being intercepted by collective forces. We weren't just abandoning our community. We were joining a larger network of communities that shared our approach to post-catastrophe survival and social organization. The 30th day after Yellowstone erupted was when we completed our relocation to a new base of operations in territory that was controlled by alliance communities. The new location was less developed than what we had left behind, but it offered security from collective expansion efforts and access to alliance resource-sharing networks that could help us rebuild our food production capabilities more quickly than would have been possible if we had attempted to start over independently. The relocation process revealed how much our community had grown and evolved during the first month of the crisis. We weren't just a group of families who had worked together in community gardens before the eruption. We had become a functioning survival community with leadership structures, technical capabilities, and social systems that could adapt to changing conditions and maintain effectiveness, even when facing major disruptions to our operations. But the relocation also revealed that our survival was now permanently connected to broader networks and conflicts that extended far beyond our immediate community. We were part of a regional alliance system that was competing with other organizational approaches for resources, territory, and influence in the post-eruption world. Our success would depend not just on our ability to produce food and maintain community solidarity, but on our ability to contribute to alliance operations and to help create social and political systems that could provide security, and stability for cooperative communities throughout the region. Rosa spent that day coordinating with Alliance representatives to plan our integration into Alliance resource sharing and mutual defense systems. Our community brought valuable capabilities to the Alliance network, including our experience with underground growing operations, our food preservation techniques, and our community organization systems that had proven effective under extreme crisis conditions. But we also needed resources and support from the Alliance to rebuild our food production operations and to contribute effectively to Alliance security and defense capabilities. The Alliance had access to agricultural resources, technical expertise, and communication systems that could help us become more productive and more secure than we had been as an independent community. Most importantly, the Alliance provided access to broader networks of information and planning that could help us understand and prepare for the longer-term challenges that we would face as the volcanic winter continued and as regional conflicts over resources and territory intensified. We were no longer just trying to survive the immediate effects of the ash fall and temperature drops. We were participating in efforts to create sustainable social and economic systems that could function effectively in the changed environmental conditions that might persist for years or decades. That evening, I found myself reflecting on everything that had changed during the 30 days since Yellowstone had erupted and transformed our world. I had begun as a community gardener who thought his expertise in sustainable agriculture would be sufficient to help his neighbors adapt to temporary disruptions in food distribution systems. I was ending as a leader in a regional alliance that was working to create new forms of human community and social organization in response to environmental changes that had made previous approaches to survival and prosperity inadequate or impossible. My grandmother spent our first evening in the new location sharing stories about her family's experiences during the most difficult years of the Depression, when communities throughout the country had been forced to choose between different approaches to survival and social organization. She said that the families and communities who had thrived during that period were the ones who had maintained their commitment to cooperative principles and mutual responsibility, even when other approaches might have seemed more efficient or secure in the short term. She reminded me that survival during extended crisis periods wasn't just a matter of technical knowledge or resource management. It was a matter of social organization and collective commitment that allowed communities to adapt to changing conditions, while maintaining the relationships and values that made survival meaningful rather than just a matter of physical persistence. As I prepared for sleep on the 30th night, I realized that our first month of survival had been successful, not just because we had figured out how to grow food without sunlight or how to organize resource allocation during scarcity conditions. We had been successful because we had maintained our commitment to cooperative decision-making and mutual responsibility that allowed us to adapt to challenges that none of us had ever imagined facing. The ash was still falling, the temperature was still dropping, and the regional conflicts over resources and territory were intensifying as more communities faced the choice between independence and integration into larger organizational systems. But we were still together. We were still committed to the principles that had made our survival possible, and we were now part of a broader network of communities that shared our approach to creating human societies that could thrive under the changed conditions of the post-eruption world. Our first 30 days had taught us that survival wasn't just about maintaining physical life and meeting basic needs. It was about creating and maintaining the social relationships and community systems that made survival meaningful and that provided the foundation for rebuilding human civilization in ways that could be sustainable and just under the environmental conditions that were now our permanent reality. The volcanic winter was continuing, and we had no idea how long the crisis would last or what additional challenges we would face as the effects of the eruption continued to unfold. But we had learned that human communities were capable of adapting to conditions that seemed impossible, and that cooperation and mutual responsibility were not just moral principles but practical necessities for survival under conditions that made individual self-sufficiency inadequate for meeting the challenges of the transformed world we were now living in.